Hello and welcome back to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg and I am here today to do a Pulitzer Prize deep dive on the Netanyahus by Joshua Cohen. If you follow along, you know I have been working on a project where I am reading every book that has won a Pulitzer Prize for fiction. And as I go through it, I have been very hesitant to cover recent Pulitzer Prize winning books. The primary reason for that is quite simple. We don't know what the ultimate legacy of a recent winner will be. We don't know if it will stand the test of time, if the author will be remembered, or if the book will even age well. We can't possibly know those things, so it feels safer to stick with books and authors further in the past. However, it recently occurred to me that there is actually a benefit to discussing recent winners of the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. One of the difficulties in looking at a winner from, say, 100 years ago is that I have to try to access the context of the time in order to understand why a particular book or author may have stood out as worthy of recognition. Sometimes it's easy to figure out, and although the process can be challenging, I admit I kind of love it. Still, I'm trying to answer a question that is significantly easier with recent winners. Because when it comes to recent winners, I already have all of the context I need to understand the environment that allowed a particular book to stand out from the pack. I may not know the ultimate legacy of a book or what that will be, but I can speak to why it felt relevant in this moment. Certainly, no recent winner is fresher in memory than the current reigning champ, Joshua Cohen's The Netanyahus, an account of a minor and ultimately even negligible episode in the history of a very famous family. And so, as we prepare to crown a new winner for the Pulitzer Prize for fiction, I decided to do my deep dive on the Netanyahus to find out how this relatively obscure novel managed to defeat some pretty major competition for the prize. And just as a little bit of bookkeeping before we jump in, I am planning this rather deliberately so that this video you are watching right now will be posted exactly 1 week before the announcement of the 2023 Pulitzer Prize for fiction. So hopefully this will be a way of building up to prize, maybe building anticipation, getting you a little bit excited for the announcement of the 2023 prize, as I am already very excited for it as well. I also would like to note that this is going to be a little bit different in terms of format than other Pulitzer Prize deep dives I have done, just because it's a recent one. For example, I usually open Pulitzer Prize deep dives with a snapshot of what was going on in the year in which a winner was published. I am not going to do that for the Netanyahus because this book was published last year. So hopefully anyone watching this video now or recently after it was published already knows the context in which this book was published, and I don't need to put it in a frame of reference for what was going on in the world at the time. I am also, as usual, going to be putting timestamps for this discussion in the description box down below. So if you would like to navigate to different parts of the conversation or jump around, you may feel free to do that. There will be minor spoilers for the Netanyahus, nothing too serious, I think, but just FYI, if you would rather read the book first, that is your decision, and I would encourage, I don't know if I would encourage you to do that. We will get into it. I will also have a link to a post on my website with the text of this conversation and links to other resources about the Netanyahus and all of that stuff. So you may check that out in the description box down below as well. Let's get into it, and let's start with what the Netanyahus is about. Reuben Bloom is a historian, and he is the only Jewish faculty member at Corbin College, nestled in a small town in the state of New York. In the fall of 1959, he is beginning the second and final year of a probationary period as a professor at this institution. If he gets through this probationary period, it's very likely that he will secure tenure. It isn't easy for him to be the only Jewish person on campus. It isn't easy for his daughter to be the only Jewish person in her high school. It isn't easy for his wife to be the only Jewish woman in the neighborhood. But Reuben and his family seem uniquely fitted for this chore. In fact, Reuben's department head praises Reuben for his ability to blend in with the rest of the faculty. Things get bumpy when Reuben is informed that financial pressures are forcing his department to hire a new professor, and that other cash-hungry departments of the college have required that the new history professor should be able to teach across disciplines. They are going to interview Benzion Netanyahu, and Reuben is asked to escort Netanyahu while he is on campus in an inappropriate presumption that their shared religion makes Rubin the perfect man for the job. It also puts Rubin in an uncomfortable predicament. Do his colleagues expect him to be their spy, to determine if Netanyahu is an acceptable Jew? If he ends up recommending that Netanyahu should be hired, will they suspect him of favoritism? What does it mean to be put in a position where you have to gatekeep your own people? When Netanyahu arrives in early 1960, he unexpectedly has his wife and 3 sons with him. Chaos ensues. And you may be wondering, is the Netanyahus based on a true story? Indeed, it is. The members of the Netanyahu family, Ben Zion, Tzila, Jonathan, Benjamin, and Ido, are all real people. And although he is a minor character of only 10 years old in the novel, Benjamin Netanyahu is the most well-known of the bunch, being a controversial politician and longtime friend of Donald Trump, although their relationship got complicated during Trump's presidency. Joshua Cohen, in interviews, has said that he was interested in this topic because he was kind of thinking of Ben Zion Netanyahu and Benjamin Netanyahu as a stand-in for Donald Trump and Donald Trump's father, which I think is worth mentioning here. Benjamin Netanyahu's political fortunes have been a roller coaster since the beginning of his political career, but particularly since the Netanyahus was published in June of 2021. The same month, Benjamin Netanyahu was removed from his second stint as prime minister after years of corruption charges and indictments. The Netanyahus won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction a year later on May 9th, 2022. By December of that year, Benjamin Netanyahu had made a staggering return to power and was sworn in as prime minister of Israel again. But the Netanyahus doesn't really interrogate who Benjamin Netanyahu is or his legacy, so I also don't really want to get bogged down in that. So I'm just going to say that if you're interested, I will put a link to Benjamin Netanyahu's Wikipedia page in the description box down below. It is wild, and it is long, and it is very detailed. It will give you a lot of the information you would be looking for. And if you would rather focus on Benjamin's father, Ben Zion, who is much more central to the plot of this book, he also has a detailed Wikipedia page. I will also put that one in the description box down below. The Netanyahus is also inspired by a story Harold Bloom told author Joshua Cohen about a time he was asked to host Ben Zion Netanyahu at Yale, and how Netanyahu unexpectedly showed up with his family in tow. And if you're wondering, yes, that Harold Bloom is the one we're talking about here. Let's get into our first big question for this Pulitzer Prize deep dive. Why did the Netanyahus win a Pulitzer Prize for fiction? 2021, the year this was published, was a year that had no shortage of possible contenders for the 2022 Pulitzer Prize for fiction. The love songs of W.E.B. Du Bois by Honorée Fannone Jeffers and The Trees by Percival Everett seemed particularly poised for victory, but there were many other celebrated books from the year that could have easily claimed the title. Instead, 3 largely unknown books were named as the finalists. In fact, the way I phrased it at the time in my reaction video to the Netanyahus winning the Pulitzer Prize is that the jury had chosen chaos. I'll link that video down below if you would like to watch. 2 of the finalists, Monkey Boy by Francisco Goldman and Palmares by Gayl Jones, were completely unknown to me at the time of the announcement. And I had only heard of the Netanyahus because P-Prize, a site dedicated to Pulitzer Prize predictions, had included it in 9th place on their list of contenders. And after looking at it a little bit more, I decided to include it in my own Pulitzer Prize predictions, in which I called it a long shot. I'm just glad I included it, I guess. In an ideal world, of course, the jury for the Pulitzer Prize would simply select the books that they truly believed to be the best of the year, and the Pulitzer board, in turn, would choose the most worthy title among those as the winner. We don't live in an ideal world. Out here in reality, we have to deal with the fact that any definition of what is the best is subjective. My criteria or definition for what may be best could be wildly different from yours, and that's okay. But it does mean that there is no true best book for any given year. And of course, one could assume that the Netanyahus stood out from the competition because of its aforementioned and short-lived relevance to real-life politics. I do not think this is the case. And that short-lived relevance, or why I call it short-lived relevance, is the fact that Benjamin Netanyahu was forced out of power the same month in which this was published, and that seemed to be have an air of finality at the time this won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. However, not long after, he ended up returning to power. So there were articles at the time that talked about how timely it was because Benjamin Netanyahu left power, and he's back. Anyway, given all of that context about the field, I have two theories for how the Netanyahus defied the odds to become the Pulitzer Prize winner for fiction. My first theory stems from a conspiracy theory about how Pulitzer Prizes for fiction are chosen. And before we get into it, I just want to say I do not like conspiracy theories in general. And like most conspiracy theories, I don't think this one is particularly credible most of the time. There are people, however, who believe that Pulitzer juries deliberately stack the deck to favor the novel that they would like to see win the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. This is because the jury does not actually choose the winner for the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. They only select the finalists. It used to be that a jury would make a recommendation to the Pulitzer board, but this may not be the case any longer because Michael Cunningham indicated that he and his fellow jurors were not allowed to make a case for any particular book when they submitted their finalists for 2012. The Pulitzer board either selects a winner from the finalists or asks for another option, and it isn't revealed if that happens. All I can say is that the only recent year which has more than 3 finalists was 2015, when All the Light We Cannot See prevailed. Or the board can decide not to award a prize at all. And I think that is very unlikely to happen anytime soon after the controversy that came when no prize was given in 2012. Basically, at the end of the day, the jury can only actually control which books the board is able to select from. The idea, then, is that a jury will select 2 ringers to go alongside the book that they would like to see win. It's difficult, though, to go through winners and finalists year by year to find an example when this might have happened. The closest I could guess is that in 2011, there were 2 books that seemed to be frontrunners for the Pulitzer Prize for fiction: Jonathan Franzen's Freedom and Jennifer Egan's A Visit from the Goon Squad. But only Goon Squad was named as a finalist, which probably cleared its path to victory. So the only case I could possibly point to where the jury stacked the deck, they would have done so by deliberately omitting Freedom as a possible contender. Now, looking at the 3 finalists for 2022, there is definitely an odd book out: Palmares. Both of the other contenders, Monkey Boy and the Netanyahus, were written by men, blur the line between fact and fiction, and have themes related to the Jewish religion. On the one hand, and this will play into my second theory, maybe that shows that the jury had a preference for this type of book. On the other hand, maybe the fact that 2 of the books are so similar, at least in brief overview, means that they were deliberately chosen to allow the third book to stand out. Now, although I had not heard of Gayl Jones or Palmares when the Pulitzer Prizes were announced, she is absolutely someone that a jury of literary people would be invested in. She was discovered by Toni Morrison when Morrison was still working as an editor, and that affiliation has become part of Gayl Jones's lore. She was subsequently praised by literary giants such as James Baldwin and John Updike, but when a tumultuous marriage ended in her husband's suicide in 1998, Gayl Jones withdrew from public life. Palmares was her first published work in 22 years. But her return to the literary world was fairly muted. It was her inclusion as a Pulitzer Prize finalist that put a spotlight on her and gave her the degree of literary celebrity she is currently enjoying. As such, it would not at all surprise me to learn that the Pulitzer jury for 2022 was actually trying to stack the deck for Gayl Jones, but it backfired because the Pulitzer board selected a different finalist. It would kind of make sense if none of the buzzier, more lauded, more best-selling books of the year had made it as a finalist if the jury was trying to make a case for Gayl Jones. And if this was the intention of the jury, they can feel good about themselves because even though she didn't win, they did successfully bring Gayl Jones into the spotlight. My second theory for how the Netanyahus won could actually exist hand in hand with the first theory. That is to say, they could technically both be true. Because even if the jury was trying to stack the deck for Palmares, something made the Netanyahus stand out to the Pulitzer board instead. And that something could be that the Netanyahus is a novel about discrimination against Jewish people, and it was published at a time when anti-Semitism is, unfortunately, on the rise in the United States. One of the most interesting things about working my way through this Pulitzer Prize project of mine is asking myself two different questions. One, why this book? And two, why was it important to recognize this book at that time? The Grapes of Wrath contextualized what many Americans had recently survived in the Dust Bowl. Dragon's Teeth galvanized Americans against the Nazi menace during World War II. The Overstory is an environmental epic published at a time when climate change has become urgent and there is a desperate need to address it. And the Netanyahus grapples with the unseemly and often hidden history of anti-Semitism, particularly in the United States, giving weight to an alarming problem where the current political landscape in this country is leading to a rise in anti-Semitic activity. Selecting a book that grapples with Jewish identity, representation, and discrimination throughout history shines a light on an ongoing problem. A problem that, like racism, many Americans would prefer to pretend doesn't exist anymore. Now, I like the subtle political messaging behind rewarding the Netanyahus, and I do think that's an urgent issue. I just wish I liked the vessel for that message better. And I wish it actually did just one of the things I listed that as a reason that this felt like a book with an urgent political message for the Pulitzer Board to hold up. Which is a perfect segue into a conversation of what I thought of the novel. Way to go, me. Look, I don't want to mince words here. I did not like this book at all. In fact, I had begun to actively resent it by the end, and I wanted to throw it across the room when I finished. I didn't, though. There are elements of an interesting novel in the first 100 pages when the focus is on Reuben and his role at Corbin College. The scene where Reuben meets with his department head near the opening of the novel is firing on all cylinders. It's a scene that reveals a lot while moving the plot forward. It has thematic resonance, and it manages to be almost scathingly funny. In a sly way, not a ha-ha way. It makes me wish that this was an actual campus novel about the only Jewish faculty member in a small town in New York in 1959. All of the parts of this book that I actually like are about how Reuben fits into the world of Corbin College, how he's asked to dress up as Santa at a Christmas party, and how it is explained to him as only fair that he dress up as Santa so the people who actually celebrate Christmas can be free to enjoy the party. Reuben must endure countless oblivious indignities just to get by in the world. And the Netanyahus is at its best when we get to casually watch this in action. Unfortunately, Joshua Cohen is getting in his own way, even in this early section of the novel. There are long passages with Reuben's thoughts on history and religion. We get a lot of backstory about Reuben's education, both secular and religious, as well as the history of his parents and his in-laws. And interestingly, the clash between what these two different sets of parents represent seems more interesting to Cohen than Reuben's own wife, who remains a very thinly defined character throughout. The text is so unnecessarily eloquent that it quickly begins to feel like reading a thesis that a student labored over with a thesaurus, so it would sound more intelligent. Now look, I am not someone with a superb vocabulary, but I know quite enough to get by, and yet I had to look up many words in this novel, and every single time there was a much simpler and more direct way of saying whatever it was that Cohen wanted to say. I'm willing to believe that these grievances in particular are deliberate on Joshua Cohen's part. He is speaking to us as a history professor, so this is someone who would naturally turn much of his daily life into an extension of his work. This is someone whose reputation depends on showing his intelligence in how he expresses himself. So maybe he doesn't even realize that the language he uses is showy to the point of madness. The problem is that after being so frustrated by this novel, I don't have the stamina to read another one of Cohen's books to determine if this is just who he is or if it's just who Reuben is. Still, if the novel stayed in this realm, the realm of the campus novel, it would be everything it was praised for being. But the title of this book is The Netanyahus, so they're bound to show up at some point. To be fair, though, The Netanyahus actually goes off the rails right before the titular family shows up halfway through the novel. The derailing begins with a dream sequence that ominously foreshadows the plot development to come, something I will always be primed to despise, by the way. Reuben's daughter, Judith, enacts an overly elaborate scheme to get her grandfather to break her nose so badly that she will get the nose job she has been wanting for so long. As an aside, the ways in which different people develop different forms of self-loathing about something they worry will out them as someone who isn't part of what they see as normal society is endlessly fascinating. Novels like Nella Larsen's Passing or Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye are based on these forms of self-loathing, and they are essential. We need these stories because we need to puncture them. A novel about the only Jewish faculty member at a college in 1959 with a daughter who is obsessed with fixing her nose, the nose being a central stereotype in anti-Semitic caricatures, would be a great addition to this canon. If only Judith made any sense as a character, and if only Cohen had any interest in completing the thought that he presents to the readers in having her act this way. It's at this point that the Netanyahus takes a very sharp turn into becoming an outlandish cartoon. The circumstances of Judith getting her nose broken defy credulity. The reactions to it are bizarre and nonsensical, and even more bizarrely, Cohen packages it as a period to a debate Judith had waged with her grandfather over the subject of fairness. And it does not compute at all, at least not with me. And then Cohen leans even harder into the cartoonish vibe when the Netanyahus finally arrive in a fever dream of entitlement, poop jokes, rudeness, misbehaving children, and smelly diapers. After this overly comical introduction, we begin to follow along as Reuben escorts Netanyahu through his engagements on campus. Really, this is just an excuse for Cohen to allow Netanyahu to take over the philosophical musings as he goes about the interview process. Cohen ends chapters at moments designed to punctuate a point that Netanyahu makes. And because he doesn't give any other character room to disagree with Netanyahu, it feels designed to highlight Netanyahu and his perspective. Reuben does seem to resent Netanyahu's entitlement and occasionally dismisses Netanyahu's conclusions, but he ends up questioning his own beliefs far more than he interrogates Netanyahu's. And it feels like the book is structured so that the reader will do the same. We are prompted to question Reuben more than we're prompted to question Netanyahu. So what is Cohen doing? What is his intent in introducing a real-life figure and allowing him to dump his philosophy on the reader? What is the point of making vague references to the controversial future of that man's son if Cohen would clearly rather not engage with what that future politician will do? If this were indeed intended to be Reuben reflecting on these encounters from a time when he knows what happens to Ben Zion and his son, which we know is the case because he makes these vague references to it, wouldn't you think that Reuben would be making an attempt to reconcile what happened then with what he knows now? Clearly, this book is intended to be more about Ben Zion than it is intended to be about Benjamin. Nowadays, thanks to his son's stature, Ben Zion is seen as a figurehead of Israel, but he enjoys that position strictly because his son happens to be Israel's on and off prime minister. It's not something he necessarily earned on his own. Here's how Cohen explains that in an interview. Quote, "I also wanted to explore what it meant to be left out of history in a strange way. With Ben Zion Netanyahu, there was this seething resentment of a person who had deserved more and thought he should have had a role in the early state and he was a man born to lead. But during the most important decade in modern Jewish history, when the state of Israel is being founded and Jews are being slaughtered in Europe, he's in America. There is a certain kind of return of the repressed when the father who is kept out of history raises the son who must return and destroy. A lot of these were the questions that were stirred up under Trump, and the idea of writing about these things directly was somewhere between boring and too difficult. So I felt like this minor negligible event had all of these possibilities." End quote. The article that comes from will be linked in the website post that I have down below in the description box. Now, this is all well and good, but the text itself doesn't give you that. It relies on the reader to know who the Netanyahu family is. It relies on the reader to apply the greater context of what is happening in this novel. Maybe I'm cynical, but I don't believe many Americans have the level of understanding required to connect the dots about the Netanyahu family, the formation of Israel, or the current political state of Israel, to put all of that into proper perspective. I know I don't. And since Cohen steadfastly refuses to guide his reader, this novel ends up being nothing more than a sounding board. A reader will hear nothing but the echo of their own opinion coming back at them. And just for good measure, Reuben comes home 9 pages before the book ends to discover what may be a sexual assault, but also might not be. It's like setting off a grenade right before a novel ends and not telling the reader who lives or dies or what happened or who did it or any of that information that a reader might want. The only part of this book where Cohen attempts to put the Netanyahu family in context is in the afterword, where he still doesn't do much to frame why he thought this was a relevant story to tell. You have to look to interviews for that. This afterword is also insane to me, because in it, Cohen offers teases of other stories that Harold Bloom shared with him during their brief connection before Bloom's death. He then claims that the character of Reuben Bloom is not a fictionalized version of Harold Bloom, nor is Reuben's wife a fictionalized version of Harold's wife. He also bizarrely informs the reader that there is a real-life reference point for the character of Judith, then says that he agreed to hide their identity since they wanted no part of this novel. But he shares details about this person's identity, which means that anyone who really wanted to dig into the matter could probably find out who they are. He also reveals that this person added Joshua Cohen to their newsletter about homeopathic remedies, and he includes the full text of a truly bizarre email that this person sent to Cohen in response to a copy of the manuscript of the Netanyahus that he sent to them. This feels very mean-spirited to me. It's not essential information for a reader, especially if Cohen had agreed to keep their identity a secret. And even worse, in that email that he publishes, the real-life Judith, I don't know what their real name is, identifies as non-binary. But Cohen has been referring to them with female pronouns. So not only is Cohen providing us with a lot of information he did not need to give us despite promising the person anonymity, he has been probably deliberately misgendering them the whole time. That's despicable. It made me so angry. Look, getting back to the novel itself, I just don't think this is a text that succeeds at what it wants to do. There are elements of important things here, but ultimately Cohen does not say anything about them. There are teases for important questions, but ultimately Cohen does not attempt to answer them. And while I don't think a novel necessarily needs to provide answers, I do think it should have the courage of its convictions. If you come to the Netanyahus looking for a polemic about anti-Semitism, you will be disappointed. If you come to the Netanyahus looking for a campus novel, you will be disappointed. If you come to the Netanyahus looking for a deeper understanding of a troublesome political figure currently having an impact on our world, you will be disappointed. And if you come to the Netanyahus looking for reflections on the Jewish identity, you'll find them, but I can't imagine you will leave satisfied. At the end of the day, there are elements of all of those things to be found in the Netanyahus, although I think you have to reach for some of them. It feels like people have grafted specific meanings onto a novel that just doesn't support them. So what are we doing here? I guess we'll just have to continue wondering. In the meantime, let's talk about who Joshua Cohen is. Now, there's not a whole lot of information about Joshua Cohen online. He seems to be a very private person, and that is fine, so let's just respect his privacy and cover just broad strokes, basics, and what you'll find on his Wikipedia page. Born in 1980, Joshua Cohen grew up in Atlantic City in New Jersey and studied composition at the Manhattan School of Music. And then leaving the Wikipedia page, The Netanyahus was Cohen's sixth novel, and thanks to the Pulitzer Prize, it is his first to become widely known. Although he is no stranger to acclaim. His novel, Wits, was named as a best book of 2010 by The Village Voice, and Four New Messages was selected by The New Yorker as a best book of 2012. He has also worked as an editor and a translator. Here is something that Harold Bloom said to Joshua Cohen about his work during a 2018 interview. Quote, Call It Sleep by Henry Roth, Miss Lonely Hearts by Nathaniel West, Sabbath's Theater by Philip Roth, and quite possibly your Book of Numbers are the four best books by Jewish writers in America. Your Moving Kings is a strong and rather hurtful book, but that helps validate it. Book of Numbers, however, is shatteringly powerful. I cannot think of anything by anyone in your generation that is so frighteningly relevant and composed with such continuous eloquence. There are moments in it that seem to transcend our impasse. End quote. Moving into some other categories, there are no adaptations or sequels of the Netanyahus at this time. And let's just get into the question of what the Netanyahus' competition for the Pulitzer Prize for fiction was. You can refer back to the section about why the Netanyahus won the Pulitzer Prize for more details, but the other finalists, once again, were Monkey Boy by Francisco Goldman and Palmares by Gayl Jones. As I discussed in that section, I have two theories for why the Netanyahus edged them out to win the prize. What I can't explain is how the jury arrived at these finalists in a year that was really loaded with other possibilities. I'm not a Jonathan Franzen fan, but many people who are have referred to Crossroads as his best work yet. Robert Jones Jr. had a really stunning debut with The Prophets. Maggie Shipstead was a Booker finalist for Great Circle, and that's just a sample of what 2021 had to offer the fiction world. If I were in charge, my finalists would have been The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois by Honorée Fannone Jeffers, The Trees by Percival Everett, and Zorrie by Laird Hunt. That takes us to the ultimate question we have here. Should the Netanyahus have won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction? In case you can't tell, I do not think the Netanyahus was worthy of a Pulitzer Prize for fiction. I wouldn't even put it anywhere near the top 10 books of 2021. It's a frustrating, unsatisfying reading experience. And again, I don't think it adequately does the things it is frequently credited with doing. Frankly, I find it ludicrous that neither The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois nor The Trees were in the mix. And while I've only read half of The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois at this time, I am writing this, and none of The Trees yet, I firmly believe that either one of them would have made a better winner than the Netanyahus. I think The Trees in particular seems to be a book that a lot of people are continuing to talk about, and people will probably continue to talk about for a very long time. Personally, of the two, I would lean toward The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois. I love how Honorée Fannone Jeffers frames her novel, so I'm going to let her do it. Quote, I describe this story as a kitchen table epic. You know, when we think of epic in the Western tradition, it's always the heroic feats of white men. That story has already been told. I didn't want to tell that story. I wanted to tell the story of heroic black women and dark-skinned black women. And selfishly, I think Percival Everett is going to be in the mix for a Pulitzer again. He is a prolific writer. He has churned out a lot of work in recent years, so I think we're going to get another chance to reward him. Who knows how long it may take for us to get another novel from Honorée Fannone Jeffers. She's already had a long career as a poet and an educator, and this is, as it stands, her only novel. I don't know when we will get another one from her. I would have given the prize to her. I would love to hear your thoughts about this. If you have read the Netanyahus, let me know what you thought of it. If you disagree, let's talk it out in the comment section down below. I'd love to hear what other contenders from 2021 you think could have been candidates for the prize, and let me know if there's a candidate that you think should have won instead. Let's put all of that in the comment section down below. As always, I really appreciate your time, and I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.